pleasure to welcome everyone this evening, Yom Yerushalayim, and we commemorate the reunification of Yerushalayim, the 28th of Iyar, and the establishment of Israeli control over the old city following the Six-Day War in 1967, which allowed Jews to access the holiest parts of the city, particularly the Kotel. And the chief rabbi of Israel declared Yom Yerushalayim Day a minor religious holiday to thank Hashem for victory and for answering the 2,000-year-old prayer next year in Yerushalayim. Well, it's a particular pleasure to welcome Richard back because Richard was actually the first speaker that we had on Zoom last year when we were in a major lockdown, so a month after we went into lockdown. And what's particularly significant is that Richard is actually in Yerushalayim this evening. So that has particular significance. And he's in a new position now as director of BICOM in Israel. And the situation vis-a-vis the UK and Israel as regards COVID and also vaccinations, which I think is important. And the political situation hasn't exactly moved on since we last met, Richard, but except the Abraham Accords have moved further into realization. So Richard has over 15 years experience working alongside government officials, diplomats and journalists, regularly briefing British audiences on Israeli politics and security issues. And he has appeared on the BBC and written a range of publications. And he's also responsible for delegations that BICOM bring to Israel. BICOM, I should hasten to add, is the British Israel Communications and Research Centre in Israel. And Richard joined BICOM for the Israeli Prime Minister's office, where he spearheaded the engagement with foreign press. And following the Second Lebanon War, he received the Prime Minister's Prize for Excellence. And Richard served in the IDF Armoured Brigade, where he twice received commendations and continues to serve in the reserves. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining me this evening. What I thought I would do, I'll just say a few opening words about Yom Yerushalayim and about some of the events that were going on over the last few days, and then I'll focus on some of the political developments. And I'm going to try and keep it relatively short because I really would prefer to get to your questions to understand exactly what you're interested and focused in, and then you can happily ask me anything what's related to politics or COVID or the security issues that we have. So I'll start and first of all, as you absolutely said in your introduction, the significance of Yom Yerushalayim. Perhaps I was trying to think it must be the most modern kind of minor festival that we have had, obviously having it just been initiated after the 67 conquest of Jerusalem. And when I was sent yesterday, and it just got me thinking the words of the late Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs that told the story when he first went to Israel in 1967, and he stood on Mount Scopus, Har Tzofim, and looked over the old city, and he had a realization that he was standing in the same spot that Rabbi Akiva and some of the other rabbis had stood and mourned, looking at the old city when it was destroyed, what was the former temple. And the rabbis were tearful as they saw a fox running around the ruins of what used to be the Holy of Holies. And actually, Rabbi Akiva was smiling and laughing. And the other rabbis asked him, "Why are you happy? We're overlooking the destruction of our temple." And Rabbi Akiva answered and saying that just as there was prophecy that there would be destruction, there is also prophecy that would be renewal and rebuilding as well. And I think that's essential. That shouldn't be lost on any of us. And it reminds kind of pertinent for me. I've been living in Jerusalem for the last 22 years, and certainly do not take for granted the fact that it's our generation that has seen the unification of Jerusalem and the control of Jewish sovereignty once again after 2,000 years. And I think if you'd have asked going back any of our families 2 or 3 generations, if their ancestors kind of would witness this moment, they wouldn't have believed it. And so I think it's incredibly poignant and striking that you in the diaspora are marking Jerusalem Day, and so I very much appreciate that. And you're with my heart in my heart, even though we are far away. One shouldn't ignore the fact, and if I just say a few words just on the current situation, that in the last few days or the last couple of weeks, we are in a very series of heightened tension with regards to the Palestinians, and that's come across by a kind of a culmination of various factors that have kind of brewed together to create quite a toxic mix. The culmination at the same time of the end of Ramadan, that the Ramadan fast ends in 3 days' time, and that we saw on the last Friday of Ramadan, which was this Friday past, some more serious and severe rioting through the night on Friday. Obviously, this is also connected to the fact that the Palestinians had elections that were announced and then postponed. Predictably, that's been blamed, at least on the surface, on Israel not allowing or not consenting to allowing elections to be held in East Jerusalem as well, although specifically Israel hadn't given even an answer before it was postponed. So it's very much being used as a pretext for calling them off. And I think the real reason why they're being called off is that the Fatah party, which is led by Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority chairman, is concerned that just like in 2006, the last time they held elections, it very much seems that the Fatah ticket itself is fragmented and split. And so there was a real chance that Hamas could do quite well here. And that obviously that fear of losing the elections meant that they've called them off. So that's a concern. And then the other issue that you've probably heard of as well is the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, which is just north of the old city, if people have their orientation, literally a couple of kilometers north, also referred to as the Simon, the Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. And this is a case, kind of a microcosm of perhaps the tragedy of 48, but this was a Sephardic Jewish neighborhood prior to 48. Whilst it was in control of the Jordanians from 48 to 67, the Jordanians resettled Palestinian refugees who had lost their homes in other parts of the country. And then in 67, when Israel regained control, those same people with the deeds to the properties tried to reclaim their home, and it's basically been in the courts for the last 20 or so years, and finally come to a decision that the ownership is legitimate and that the Palestinian families could well be kicked out. The latest news on that, thankfully, I think, in the context of everything of Ramadan and Jerusalem Day, etc., that was meant to the court will issue their final verdict tomorrow and put a date on it. They've actually postponed it now by another month, which gives us a little bit of leeway and breathing space, at least with regard to the Sheikh Jarrah situation. I should tell that Israel is not kind of without fault either. Certainly, there are aspects of the hard right that are looking to kind of to galvanize this and provoke and stoke the violence. We saw 2 weeks ago a rally by the Lahava organization, which is kind of an anti-assimilation, anti-Arab group that started rallying and marching towards the eastern part of the city, and the police stopped them there. And also, in the context of the Israeli elections, which I'll talk about in a minute, one of the hard right Israeli politicians, perhaps the most extreme guy that entered the Knesset, Itamar Ben-Gvir, set up provocatively his kind of constituency office, so to speak, his Knesset office on the street outside of the homes that were about to be dispossessed in Sheikh Jarrah. And that was also kind of a moment which saw violence around that site at the end of last week. Compounding that and just kind of filling out the security picture, there is a lot of concern that this violence is being led by Hamas because of their frustration over being denied what they would have seen as their potential election victory. So we've seen an increase of rocket fire. We had 2 weekends ago 40 rockets fired over a 2-day weekend. Thankfully, no one on the Israeli side was seriously injured. Just this evening, we've seen about half an hour ago, before starting this call, we saw another couple of rockets fired towards Ashkelon. So that is also a trend that we're monitoring with great concern. And we've also seen as we had an
Yeah, you've frozen temporarily, hope. Richard?
I was cut off, but now I'm back. Can you hear me? You're on mute, but I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Fine.
You were talking about Ashkelon and said
yes. So there were a couple of rockets on Ashkelon just about half an hour ago. So obviously that's a very serious concern that we're monitoring. And the other aspect, which we saw from a couple of years ago, the phenomena of sending what was called kind of incendiary balloons and kites to set fire to the fields outside the Gaza envelope, also has restarted over the last few days. And I saw one unconfirmed report of about 30 or so fires that were started today on the Gaza border. So all of that kind of is of concern. And the third area of violence is obviously in the West Bank. We've seen a spate of attempted stabbing attacks, but I think more significantly, in terms of the ratcheting up of the escalation of the violence, we've seen two shooting attacks, drive-by shootings in the last 10 days. One of them killed an Israeli civilian who was rushed to hospital in critical condition and later died of his wounds. And then also just at the end of last week, another shooting attack right on the northern edge of the West Bank, or potentially of a car that was trying to break through the checkpoint to carry out an attack inside Israel proper, was also thwarted. So those three realms of Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, all with their own dynamics, but all very much connected by the kind of what Israel considers terrorist groups, primarily Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who are influencing proceedings and trying to whip up a crowd. And so this is kind of major concern. In parallel to all this is the political situation, the ongoing political stability. And I think it is worth making the connection as well, because neither of these things are happening in a vacuum. And it's been quite convenient and probably suggested by analysts today that the political instability and the possibility of Netanyahu being replaced is not missed on Israel's enemies, who are using this period of time of uncertainty also to ratchet up the pressure. And so there we saw comments from Nasrallah in Hezbollah in Beirut, making comments to that effect. And that's obviously also a great deal of concern. Now, in terms of the politics, I thought it was worth just to do a quick update to say where we are and how we got here, and then a little bit about where things could go from here, and then I'll stop and take any questions. So people may have seen that last week was an incredibly significant week in Israeli politics. The 28-day period that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to form a government lapsed, came to an end, and he returned the mandate back to President Rivlin. And then Rivlin, taking a day to make consultations with the various leaders of the parties, came to the decision that now Yair Lapid was entrusted to form a government. This is the first time Yair Lapid, from the centrist Yesh Atid party, who's been in politics since 2012. He first entered into the Knesset 2013. 9 years later, he's now getting his chance for the first time ever to potentially form a government. And this is where we are this week. That the idea is, and perhaps Dave, at this moment, we could share screen and just show the spread of the Knesset, just so people are familiar with the lie of the land, so to speak.
Sorry, you want the screen shared now?
Yes, please. Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks, Dave. So this is the spread of the current Knesset, basically. And if you look first of all on the right-hand side, that at the time a month ago, Netanyahu had marginally more support. And I'll explain afterwards why, because the 57 that was in the opposing Netanyahu camp, not all of them endorsed Lapid first time round. Neither of the Arab parties did, and neither did New Hope, which is the Gideon Saar party, which is there in the middle. So they were basically, Lapid last time round was left with 45 support, and Bibi had the 52 that you can see there. And so Bibi was given the first chance to form a government, and heavy pressure was put on Naftali Bennett from the Yamina party and the Ram party, which is the Islamic party. Now, let me just break that down quickly, because there's a fascinating phenomena going on right now in Israeli politics, that for the first time ever, it's actually ironically by the Israeli right wing, led by Netanyahu and the Likud party, that have legitimized the Israeli Arab participation in Israeli politics. No less than that. If you remember the furor that was met this time last year, well, March 2020, after the results, when Benny Gantz, who was competing it before he joined the unity government, was persuading the Arab list, the joint Arab list, to endorse him as prime minister, and the Likud ran a most horrific campaign against him. How dare you? Kind of the idea of having Arab support was an aberration to them. Fast forward 12 months later, and it's actually the Likud over the last 12 months that have led the engagement and the legitimization of the Ram party. And really, it's because of the Ram, the leader of the Ram party, who is a guy called Mansour Abbas, who, although he represents, the Ram is the southern branch of the Islamic movement here in Israel. But Mansour Abbas has taken an unprecedented and incredibly pragmatic approach of where, unlike previous deals, he doesn't want to see himself as part of the left, or of where Israeli Arab parties have traditionally aligned themselves. He wants to be seen as open to do business with everyone, and in that very pragmatic, transactional sense, they've already worked some deals in the Knesset with the Likud, working on 2 or 3 substantial issues. For example, choosing the state ombudsman last year, which relied on the hard right and the Islamic party. Other forms of coalition sharing and cooperation, which has really taken it to unprecedented levels. So the fact that the Likud has legitimized this party now leaves it open for the other side also to engage with them. But essentially, the only party that refused, why Likud weren't able to form a government, was because the religious Zionist party that you can see next to the Likud, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I mentioned before, and Bezalel Smotrich, were the only hard right party on the Israeli, that whole political spectrum, that refused the idea of partnering with Ram. For them, they are terrorist supporters and Israel's enemies, and it's inconceivable that they would be sitting with them. And by the way, although I think that, I'll be honest and say that their politics are pretty disgusting in places. I mean, they are an anti-Arab and homophobic party, and not part of kind of the liberal mosaic, which is for the majority of Israeli society. I'll admit that their reason has some political logic in it. And the political logic says that as soon as the hard right legitimizes the hard right of the Islamic party, then all bets are off in the future, and that every Israeli government can then be built up with the Arab support. And that would essentially, in the long term, obviously benefit the center-left in Israeli politics. So Smotrich, understanding that, stuck to his guns, refused the idea of sitting in a coalition being backed by the support of Ram, and therefore Netanyahu failed, and the mandate was handed over to Lapid. And Lapid, as I said, he got 45 support last time. This time round, the New Hope party, led by Gideon Saar, endorsed him as well, as did 5 of the 6 of the joint list. And again, to clarify, I've been talking about Ram, which is the Islamic party, but the joint list is the other Arab party, made up of 3 smaller parties: the Israeli Communist Party, Tal, which is a kind of secular nationalist party, and Balad, which is also secular pan-Arab, obviously very pro-Palestinian. And in fact, it was the 5 out of the 6 of those factions. The one Balad representative refused to endorse Lapid, but the other 5 did. So with 56 seats backing him, he was then able to be given the mandate. And the chances are, and again, this is kind of, as we look slightly forward now, and I use my crystal ball to offer some speculation about where this is all going. The chances are, even though on paper 56, 57 seats is again not enough to reach the magic 61 mark of a majority government, it is thought that the combined forces that you can see, those 7 parties on the graph, two left-wing parties, 2 centre parties, and 3 right-wing parties, those 7 parties are all kind of working together now to form a government, which will also have the support of at least one of the Arab parties, and what we call here it best translates as a blocking majority, i.e. that they will either abstain from the vote, coordinated, or for specific votes they will lend the government their votes to make sure that it can pass no confidence motions, and that's exactly where they're being debated at the moment. And so the chances are that, generally speaking, people are optimistic that Yair Lapid could well be able to form a government. He has 28 days, but he could do so even within the next few days. And I'll just finish by kind of giving the parameters of what this government looks like, because to get the buy-in of Yamina that you can see on this graph was deliberately hedging their bets to try and make a power play led by Naftali Bennett, not to commit either to the camp of what's euphemistically being called the Bloc for Change, which is the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or Netanyahu. That the trade-off is that Lapid himself may agree to a rotation agreement of the role of prime minister, and that Naftali Bennett himself could actually become prime minister, even though his party only has 7 seats. In fact, he only has 6 loyal seats, because one of his backbenchers has already said that he can't, with good conscience, go into a government with the left wing. So even the Yamina on paper, which has 7 in front of us, is actually already been reduced to 6. Nevertheless, this could be enough for him to become prime minister, and in that scenario, Yair Lapid himself would become the alternate prime minister and take over probably in a couple of years' time. In the meantime, he will serve as foreign minister. It's thought that Benny Gantz from the Blue and White Party, who is currently defense minister, will remain in that role. Avigdor Lieberman, who's from the party next door, Yisrael Beitenu, which is the secular right-wing, predominantly Russian-speaking partner, will be the finance minister, and Gideon Saar from the New Hope would be the justice minister. And now they're debating what the Labour Party will get. She wants to be, there's a new leader of the Labour Party, Merav Michaeli, who's a very serious and accomplished woman. In fact, the only party actually at the moment being led by a woman. And she's a candidate to become education minister. And now they need to find something reasonable and respectful for the head of Meretz as well. So you can see that all of these things are coming together, and we actually could have a government here even within the next few days. Lots of permutations still to be working out. What does this government have in common? Obviously, ideologically, it has very little in common, and that the basis of this government would be a non-ideological basis. It would be very much I won't call it a technocrat government, because these are professional politicians with their own ideology, but the idea is that because of the broad base of this government, they would put their ideological issues on the side, and they would focus on primarily, first of all, passing a budget, because we haven't had one of those for 2 years because of the political stalemate, passing a budget, reinvigorating the economy, finding jobs for people, investing in transportation and infrastructure, in education, in the hospitals, and basically doing what Lapid has campaigned for as a sane, rational, reasonable government that will work in the interests of the people. And it's hoped that those shared agenda pieces can kind of unite a very divergent ideological spread from the quite hard right of Naftali Bennett to the hard left of Meretz, and kind of bring in the Israeli spectrum in this, as I said, what's being euphemistically called the Bloc for Change. How long can a government like that last? I wouldn't give it too much. I wouldn't give it too much of a life expectancy. The hope is that it can last 1 year. That's kind of, I think, a reasonable, and I mean, it's not setting the bar very high, but after the craziness that we've had over the last 2.5 years, a government of stability for a year that can kind of put the economy back on track, etc., and kind of reprioritize those budgetary issues should at least be a head start. And then it becomes a question of in whose interest will it be to fragment and to pull this government apart. But I'm getting way ahead of myself because the government hasn't even been formed yet. So I'll stop there and I will welcome any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Richard, for analysing it so carefully for us. It's such a complex issue. What I wanted to say, perhaps to start off, is start the ball rolling. I mean, with the stalemate that the Israeli government have been in, how can anything, progress really?
So as I don't know, I think there are some. I mean, I'm being cautious, but cautiously, I have to say cautiously optimistic, because I think if we're honest, I mean, let's also go back and say, why did this government break down in the first place? And if we're honest, and as you know, as kind of my personally and as BICOM, I try and kind of give a balanced picture, but it's quite clear by all the analysts here that it was only led by one man, and that was Prime Minister Netanyahu, that understood that the alternate arrangement that he entered into with Benny Gantz back in April 2000, that they had, even though this was an ironclad agreement that actually changed the basic law in Israel's country to create this new role of alternate prime minister, that Netanyahu found a loophole in this agreement whereby you could collapse the government by not passing a budget at the end of last year, which would automatically trigger an election with Netanyahu being able to remain as the interim prime minister. So as far as he's concerned, sadly, he's the only one that has a vested interest in keeping this situation ongoing. That if the government doesn't get formed and we go to yet another election, then Netanyahu conveniently remains as interim prime minister. So what's really significant, the watermark that we reached last week, is that now with Yair Lapid in the driving seat, so to speak, he has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to form a government, and he understands that the weight of this opportunity and the responsibility here, and that's why it's seen that he is being prepared to be so generous with his coalition partners in order, and even giving up the prime ministerial role himself, at least in the immediate term, in order to form the government, in order to finally break the deadlock which we've had with Prime Minister Netanyahu in control for 12 years. I mean, not only is he Israel's longest serving prime minister, he served longer than Margaret Thatcher and kind of every other kind of iconic democratic leader that you can think of. He's pretty much outlasted them in 12 years. Is an incredible run in any form, in any democracy. But it does appear that time is coming to an end now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jeff, would you like to go ahead? I need to unmute.
Yeah, very good talk, thank you. You obviously understand the subject really well because there's so many parties. Right, I have two questions. Is there any chance of Israel getting rid of proportional representation? And my other question is, and what if in the future the Haredi are a majority?
Okay, thank you for those. So the truth is, electoral reform is somewhere on the agenda. It's not as striking and as kind of as top line as maybe you would expect after so much instability. It's not that the the proportional representation system, is likely to remain, because the balance is always in the system of governability balanced out against representation. And in such a fragmented society, when you have 20% who are Israeli Arab non-Jews, you have 20% who are immigrants who have arrived in the last generation or so, a creeping 11% of the ultra-Orthodox, in such a split society, that PR is really the only system that gives every party representation, and better to have people inside the tent than having to use extra or non-parliamentary means to get their voice across. What is being discussed is the idea of term limits. That's kind of a very popular line, and that's something that this new government, it was brought in, would introduce, because it's basically been played out that the old saying of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is kind of unfortunately being borne out, obviously, as we have also in the background the Prime Minister facing his trial on corruption charges, which is now kind of progressing in parallel to everything else we're saying. The Netanyahu himself has actually tried a new trick in order to cling to power by suggesting that the deadlock can be broken by changing the basic law of governance and reinstituting direct elections to the prime minister. If you remember, we went through 3 election cycles back in 1999, where we ran 3 elections where people went to the ballot and voted twice, once for a party and once for the prime minister. And the rationale behind it was that if you had a directly voted prime minister, that would create more stability. In fact, the opposite happened, that people voted for their choice of prime minister and then used their vote for the party to vote for a small single issue party that was their particular taste, and it led to less ability for governability. Anyway, Netanyahu still thinks that that's a good way to go back, because he sees himself as the polls bear out as well, unrivaled in the kind of the head-to-head race of who is the most appropriate to be and capable to be prime minister. So he's trying to initiate that, although now that he's lost control of the legislative process in the Knesset, because that's now in Lapid's hands, because he has the mandate, it seems highly unlikely that Netanyahu can push that through. With regard to your question about the Haredim, I mean, so the statistics that we had about 5 years ago, which should cause us all alarm, that going into Kita Aleph, first grade, over 50% of the children going into first grade, this is already 5 years ago, were non-Zionist. When we say non-Zionist, they were either Israeli Arab or ultra-Orthodox. And that's kind of a sign of where the demographic trend is to come. We're not there yet. This is a generational issue, because, as I said, they're climbing to about 11-12% of the overall population, the Haredim. But there's no doubt that they have wielded disproportional power because of their status within the Netanyahu government. And that's also something which is being challenged right now, that if the Bloc for Change, Lapid and Bennett combo comes through, you'll notice that the ultra-Orthodox will also potentially be left out of the coalition. And this is something that they're very fearful of. I don't think that this, as I said in my opening comments, I don't expect, because of this huge ideological diversity, that they're going to be able to tackle some of the big issues within society with regard to kind of church and state and the separation of church and state. But it's possible that they would be able to institute a law with regard to the ultra-Orthodox serving in the army. That's been a very hot political issue over the last couple of years, and it's possible they would do that. They've also already said that this new government would look to institute the chief rabbinate under what they call the Zohar, which is basically a more liberal, pluralistic expression of Orthodox Judaism, as opposed to the ultra-Orthodox domination that we have now. But they'll need to be careful not to bite off too much they can chew, or they'll get kind of a bounce back and a response from the ultra-Orthodox communities. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that develops. Certainly, if you talk about my city in Jerusalem, it's a much more potent issue, because even though they're only 11-12% of the national population, they're already close to a third of the population within the city of Jerusalem. So kind of within the municipality, I mean, we've already had an ultra-Orthodox mayor a decade ago here, but that kind of trend could potentially repeat itself. And what's fascinating, when I mentioned the Ram party, the Islamic party, they use as their model that they want to recreate the model of the ultra-Orthodox parties, of how a small single interest party can use their influence and be the axis of which kind of the deciding votes within the government, and use that to bring budget. What do Ram want? They are taking, as I said, a transactional, pragmatic approach. They're not talking about the Palestinian issue at all. I mean, they actually are today because of the violence and the demonstrations. So it's that's why I made the point about the connectivity of these issues, because they can't ignore these issues. But in terms of what they want from the coalition agreement, they are talking about budgets for the Israeli Arab communities, improvement of infrastructure, creation of jobs, housing reform. These are the issues that they're campaigning on. Again, not dissimilar to what the ultra-Orthodox would be campaigning on as well. So they've taken that model and they've copied it. And so we'll see if that plays out, and if that brings more growth to the Arab sector.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks very much for that very full answer. Right, Clemmy, you're next.
Yes, thank you for the lovely introduction. I don't think anybody will be surprised to hear me say that I am astounded that people in Israel are concerned about the ultra-Orthodox when they will countenance the inclusion of the joint list in Rum. Now, God forbid there should ever be a terrorist incident, and joint list or anybody from the joint list and Rum would refuse to condemn the terrorist incident. Would there be a consequence of that? Would they be deemed treacherous? Would there be a consequence of? Would they be legitimately allowed to remain in the Israeli government? It's not unheard of.
No, I mean it's a good question, and these are the challenges that could yet and probably will come up. Just to clarify, we're not expecting certainly the joint list to join the government. There is mixed speculation. I was just listening to a report half an hour ago about the idea of Ram, whether they will actually come into the government, whether they will vote in the swearing in favor, but still support it from outside. So we're still waiting to see exactly the machinations and the full status of it. And your question is absolutely valid, and the way that it's been framed here is if a government is reliant on the support of these parties and there is kind of continued rocket fire from Gaza and the government needs to make a decision about a military campaign, how on earth can this government expect the support and rely on the votes of either of the Israeli Arab parties when it comes to Israel's national security issues? And I think for me, the answer is relatively straightforward, is that whenever it comes to the need for a military operation, and let's hope it's not necessary, but if a wide-scale operation is required in Gaza, then it seems quite clear that they won't need to be reliant on the Arab parties' votes because they'll have the vote from the opposition. And on this case, the opposition just happens to be the Likud or the ultra-Orthodox or the religious Zionist parties, but always kind of the historical precedent when it's the other way around, the opposition has always backed the government when it comes to military operation that is deemed necessary by the full security establishment. So when there is a consensus, the overall Jewish majority will still be able to support that scenario.
I do have a second question if nobody else has a question.
Go on, go ahead, Clemmy.
It's nothing to do with politics, but it's a very serious question. Are there any health and safety checks made upon sites that are expecting large gatherings with regard to the Meron incident? Were there any health and safety checks made?
So in health and safety with regard to kind of disaster preparation or corona?
No, disaster preparation with places that are accidents waiting to happen. Is there an authority, an organization in Israel responsible for sending out agents to check on the health and safety of sites? Like there is in England. In England, you would never. I mean, the police would always check out a venue to make sure that it can tolerate the number of people coming in and such like.
Absolutely. So I mean the Meron tragedy, as horrific as it was, I mean we're still waiting to kind of the full investigation and understanding the report, but it seems a very horrific and sad case of what is an endemic that we've seen elsewhere in Israel of passing the buck and kind of the space in between authorities, that the transportation authority did one thing, the religious affairs ministry did something else, the antiquities authority also passed the buck, and it fell through, and the police are now kind of seemingly being blamed. When it comes to kind of the demonstrations in Jerusalem and access to Al-Aqsa, these things, I wouldn't say that they have their own worrying dynamic as well, but in terms of kind of health and safety, that it's first of all, it's an open space. It's not the same scenario that was the death trap that Meron turned out to be, and it's better. I'd like to think and hope that it is better regulated by the authorities, primarily the police. Although, as I said, beyond the kind of the disaster scenario, we also have a very combustible situation because of ideology and religion and Ramadan. So it has its own dynamic, which yes, the authorities certainly are prepared for, should be prepared for, but the law of unintended consequences mean we need to be ever vigilant there as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chloe.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have any more questions for Richard? Perhaps while waiting for people to think about it, thinking about that the Lapid might then form the new government. I was just
Rosemary,
wondering.
excuse me, Rochelle. Rochelle, sorry. Rosemary had her hand up.
Okay,
Rosemary.
right, thanks. Go ahead, Rosemary, and I'll go ahead after you then. Would you like to unmute yourself, Rosemary?
I don't know what you think about what I think that probably Netanyahu may be the best person for the job, and I feel that we should forget about his corruption, because I feel that he is respected, and sometimes I feel I think he's very good. And my daughter says that, members of the army could probably advise him, but I think he's so experienced with security. And I would prefer him to remain. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, listen. The country is divided. I mean, listen. If you saw the results of the election on the graph that we just showed, there's no doubt that the Likud is still far and away individually the most popular party. 30 seats. That's 25%. 1 in 4 Israelis agree with you. They look at the way that he's managed the country, the economy over the last decade. He is always kind of security risk adverse, which means he doesn't rush into military campaigns, doesn't rush into peace deals either. And yet, lo and behold, in the last year, he has brought 4 peace treaties with the Arab world, with Bahrain, UAE, the Sudan, and Morocco as well, which is unprecedented in Israeli history. And the long-term effects that will absolutely be his positive legacy. That he's brought such, and as you say, the kind of his leadership on a world stage, the fact that he is punching Israel above its weight, and that certainly over the last year, with regard to President Trump and being able to reap the rewards of that relationship, but also with President Putin as well. There's no doubt that Netanyahu deserves a lot of credit. However, the other side of it shows that there is clearly now a slim majority, and it is only a slim majority, that actively do not want him as prime minister anymore. That it's not healthy for a country with such an advanced economy and sophisticated military and civil society as well, should be in a mindset that only Bibi can do it. That we've been institutionalized for 12 years, that only he can. I'll remind you that when he was elected the first time in '96, what sort of background and record did he have then? He was only he came at the back of being a diplomat and a very smooth talker at the UN. And so the idea is that there's a generation of very capable leaders. If you look at Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, I mean, I'll talk about Naftali Bennett because he may well be the next prime minister, is a very serious guy. He kind of ticks the box on a lot of what Israeli society is looking for in their leaders. He has a very impressive military career himself, serving in one of the elite commando units. He then kind of fulfilled what I would say is the modern Israeli dream of having a high-tech startup company and then being able to sell out for multi-millions of dollars and be kind of a self-made man and a success. And since then, and for the last decade and a half, he is kind of, he would like to say it. I mean, I don't want to put the words in for anyone else, but altruistically kind of been working for the good of Israeli society and trying to benefit the good of all Israeli citizens. Yair Lapid has had a very different background, primarily in journalism, and kind of had a very popular a weekly column in the newspaper that people kind of would put their mark on, kind of the quintessential Israeliness. And so he's very much in touch with the Israeli people. He speaks for them, and also in credit to him, also ran a campaign that could have been very shrill. He could have been, if you people remember, his father, Tommy Lapid, ran on a campaign which was very anti-religious and anti-ultra-Orthodox. It was very easy, after what we've seen of the disobedience in the ultra-Orthodox sector in the last year, to run a similar campaign. But he was very statesmanlike, made a point not to attack, not to be divisive. And so together, by the way, Bennett and Lapid, they're of the same generation. They have worked together in the past. They've actually worked together in various votes and combinations within the Knesset before. One of them comes from a secular background, the other one religious. But the kind of the yin and the yang and the combined powers of them actually, I mean, personally, doesn't bring me with dread as well. I think anytime in a post-Netanyahu world, as I said, my concern is that Israel's enemies are going to use this moment of instability to test Israel, and we need to be very, very vigilant for that. But that there is the security services, the IDF, Mossad, and the Shin Bet, and I think as well that it was credit to Benny Gantz as well, who has been much maligned over the last year for his naivety in showing the responsibility of entering into that national unity government with Netanyahu, has now been borne out, but he also remains with 8 seats. I mean, 8 seats is, in the scheme of things, is not much, but in the proliferated nature of the Knesset, 8 seats still makes him the 4th largest party, I think. Only 2 parties are even in double digits. And again, as the former chief of staff, I'm personally reassured to see someone like that remain in the defense ministry. By the way, it's not a done deal. Gideon Sa'ar himself also sees himself as a candidate for defense minister, so it's still being negotiated. But I think in that kind of scenario, Israeli citizens and people like yourselves that care for Israel from afar should be able to rest easy that there is kind of responsible leadership and an appropriate experience at the helm as well. Even if kind of no one has that same repertoire as Netanyahu himself.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rosemary. John, would you like to ask next question?
Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you, Richard. Very interesting talk and answering of questions. Can I just ask you how the Israeli people view the changing government in Washington? Not just the move from Trump to Biden, but the move from the Republican fan base for Israel to the Democratic Party, who have a different view.
So again, I think Israelis are broadly are split on the subject. I mean, for some people, Trump was the great thing, the great white hope that made so many at least superficial statements and decisions which went beyond superficial and had real significance, particularly over the issue of the Golan recognition, and obviously moving the embassy to Jerusalem had significant symbolic decisions. Other people are saying that the fact that he pulled out of the Iran deal, that Iran in response was able to abrogate their side and are now sadly closer than they were beforehand under the agreement to reaching a nuclear threshold, is a real concern. And other people thought that even that the fact that the Netanyahu was so closely identified with Trump was always going to have a backlash and alienate Israel from the broad strokes of the Democrat Party. But that aside, we're now in the reality of Biden, and it's clearly not the same. But I also don't think that Biden is an Obama Mark II either. He is his own man, and for good and for bad. I mean, primarily the sense that Israeli officials have 100 days in plus from the new administration is that they just don't really care that much about Israel specifically, or about the region in general. That Biden is happy to delegate and to send off his people to conduct these talks, these proximity talks in Vienna, and there's basically the sense from Israel is that Biden has said to his people, get Iran back into compliance to the JCPOA, to the nuclear deal. And he doesn't really care about the details, and doesn't really care at this stage, at least, about the ramifications of it either. And by the way, I'm not sure it's going to be so easy for them to get back in either, because the Iranians on their side have stipulated lots of other criteria and demands and compensation issues, which I don't think the Americans are going to be so willing to enter in. And bear in mind that the clock is ticking as well, because at the end of June, the Iranians have their own elections being held, where it's widely expected that the more hawkish candidates, whoever they may be, are more likely to take over from the presidency. So there is a concern there. Do the Americans are caught in a bind? Do they rush to try and get a deal now with this current government under Rouhani and hope that it maintains itself in the next time round, or do they wait and see how the dust settles and start negotiations with the new ones? At the moment, they're doing a little bit of both. But Israel has to accept that kind of in this current president has obviously far more pressing concerns domestically. Yes, they've done other symbolic stuff to readdress some of the Trump bias of reinstating some of the funding to Palestinian institutions and to UNRWA. UNRWA, as people probably know, is a long-term bugbear of Israel that is a very corrupt and inefficient international organization that we would prefer that would disappear. Although even other Israelis have commented and saying that you can't just get rid of, even in your dream scenario of getting rid of UNRWA, you can't just do that with that and leave it in a vacuum. You need to create some other mechanism and capacity to deal with those issues, or it's going to blow up in Israel's faces if there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that no longer have the sustenance and the support that UNRWA provides. So it needs to be done in a coordinated and thought out and sensible approach, so that there will be no vacuum and that there can be no chance of the Hamas and other terror organizations manipulating the situation and taking over. Bottom line, it's not the same relationship, but the jury is still out. And I would say that for on the plus point of the Biden administration with regard to Iran, which is kind of Israel's top line concern, there was a delegation in Washington a week or so ago of the head of Mossad and other senior security chiefs. They decided that, unlike the Obama side, where they weren't really even consulting with the Israeli side, and they famously carried out the secret negotiations behind Israel's back and didn't update them. This time round, at least the sense that we have here is that things are being coordinated behind the scenes. They've shared their intelligence picture. They've shared the concerns about Iranians' regional aggression, and the intelligence picture seems to be relatively coordinated and squared up. And now it's just about how the negotiators get on in Vienna and how those talks progress.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you very much, Richard. Have we got any other questions for Richard before we round up? No. Well, I want to say thank you very much.
I've got a question.
Go on, Martin, go ahead.
I have a question, Richard. First of all, that was fascinating, especially about Israeli politics, which seems to me to be in a terrible, terrible mess. One question that I would like to ask you is, with all these minor parties, there's so many of them, and they're going to form a coalition, come into a coalition, doesn't that lead to doing deals? Well, it obviously does lead to doing deals. And doesn't that lead to corrupt practices?
Not necessarily. I mean, not every political deal has to be. We very much hope that the political deals being worked out are not corrupt. I mean, it's about people flexing their muscles and kind of pushing for the interests of what they perceive as their community, as of their electorate. I mean, lots of Israeli politicians will pay lip service to kind of working in the national interest, and that's great. And if you can define the national interest in a way that is beneficial to all the sectors, that's great. But otherwise, kind of the horse trading in the negotiations, both in terms of the cabinet portfolios that I outlined earlier, but also kind of in the broad government guidelines. And once you set the government guidelines, and they'll be published when the government is sworn in, then we can all read and understand where their legislative priorities are, where their funding priorities will be. But I think in a year, well, I said for 2 years now, where Israel hasn't passed the budget, where it's quite clear that there are so many people that have lost their jobs and been so badly affected economically, that's the overwhelming priority. And so that either they will take the recommendations of the experts within the finance ministry. There may be some there may be some sectors that will benefit more than others, but broadly speaking, there are these, I said, the emphasis on non-ideological issues of where people understand that it's in the good of the country to rehabilitate the workforce, to protect those people that have lost their income and the small businesses, particularly, and the self-employed, etc., and all sorts of sectors that have been so badly hit. That is kind of, as a first base, a reasonable kind of starting point to prioritize. Should be done without corruption and without too much underhand unnecessary deals. And the spirit, at least, in which those 7 parties and their party leaders all represent, do kind of are kind of endemic of a new post-Netanyahu politics, where people understand it's not every political deal is a zero-sum game of where if I win, you lose, so to speak. And they are trying to create win-win scenarios. And really, I mean, again, this sounds slightly rose-tinted and optimistic, and we should watch this space and see how it plays out. But at least the hope is that there will be a government that can really work into the interests of the greater society.
Right, and as a follow-up question to that, and you hinted on, or you touched on, the economy in Israel and the loss of jobs, which will all, I mean, the whole world is probably suffering from this now, and the post-pandemic world that we're entering into, that we hopefully will be entering into. Who does Israel blame for the pandemic? And what are they going to do about it, along with other countries? Because
I don't think it's I'm not sure Israel is looking to blame. I mean, I think there is blame. I mean the way that the discourse is being framed in Israel is be kind of the global pandemic is kind of gadol aleinu. It's too big for us to apportion blame there. Israel's not part of the debate of whether this was manufactured or whether this was a natural issue in Wuhan and how it developed. Israel's very much focused on how it entered Israel. And Israel had an incredible opportunity early on, because effectively, because of where Israel is geographically, Israel is an island state, and very rare for a small country to have one main point of entry and exit, being Ben Gurion Airport. And so they really felt over a year ago there could have been much tighter controls on that border, and have really controlled everything that came in. And so there's criticism of the outgoing government that gave too many people a pass and let them into the country when they were carrying disease. In fact, by the way, I mean, obviously you'll know about the success of the vaccination here, that we're leading the world in that. There was just a case on the news this afternoon that a family came back from Portugal, having been lived there for the last few months, and that they were told to go into isolation. Instead, they held a welcome home party, and it turns out that this whole family was infected with the Chilean variant of the disease, and they gave it to other guests as well. So having almost kind of 0.00 of the population affected and having almost gone, one family coming in yesterday can kind of bring it in. And one of the kids went to school, so there's kind of 1,200 kids at a school, which is now having to be tested and checked to see how far it's spread. So there's no accounting for individual irresponsibility of not following the guidelines and going into isolation when you were meant to. And so there are examples like this, but this is not a macro issue. Broadly speaking, and again, talking to Netanyahu and his success, he is very much he'd hoped to pull a bigger dividend in the elections, but he definitely deserves the credit for bringing the vaccinations so widespread to Israel so efficiently. And again, it was thanks to Israel's internal health setup of the kupot of the health funds, which was able to distribute and get the vaccines spread out so quickly here. So there's a lot of good things they've done, and obviously I could go into other sectors of Israeli society that didn't obey the rules as they could have done over the last year, and there may still be some repercussions over that. But generally speaking, they're not playing the blame game on a macro level.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Richard. I think we're going to round it up now. So thank you so much for being with us this evening, Richard. It's been very special for us. And thank you too for giving us up-to-date information, which is a major concern about the violence in Jerusalem at the moment. Also, your analysis of the political stability in the government and explaining the complexities of the various parties, it's quite tricky, I think. But thank you very much for analysing it so well. Now we can see the capabilities of some of the leaders of the other parties. So we look forward with great interest in the next few weeks to see how it's all going to pan out. But thank you very much for all those that asked questions this evening. And thank you so much, Richard, for being with us again. It's been a great pleasure to have you.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to see you all. Wishing you all well.
Yeah, and you too. Take care now.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.